And then pause recording. And we're recording. All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Doug Zemeckis, Marine Extension Agent with Rutgers Cooperative Extension. Tonight is our second of 6 seminars as part of this seminar series, All the Small Things with Big Environmental Impacts, being offered by Rutgers Cooperative Extension, where we deliver science-based educational programming to improve the quality of lives, businesses, and communities here in New Jersey in a wide range of agricultural, natural resources issues through our Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources. This seminar series, All the Small Things with Big Environmental Impacts, is a collaboration between 2 of our programs, E2D2, which is Earth Day every day, and we're looking at environmental, marine and terrestrial environmental issues this spring in response and observation of Earth Day, which was passed this weekend. Also, a collaboration with MEPS, our Marine Extension Program Seminar Series, as we combine, as I mentioned, terrestrial and marine-related environmental issues. Other extension agents involved in this program are Steve Yerjo, Amy Rowe, Michelle Bacchus, and Sal Mangiafico. And with this 6-part seminar series, we're looking at small substances or changes that are going to have large or big environmental impacts here in New Jersey, and what you all can do in order to be more responsible environmental stewards in response to these topics. Our first seminar was last week. We had Gene Epiphan from Rutgers Cooperative Extension speak about beach leaf disease. Tonight we're on a marine topic where we have Dr. Judith Weis talking about microplastics. Some navigational aids for tonight's webinar. We'll have 2 Q&A periods, approximately halfway between and at the end. For when you have questions this evening, please use the Q&A function at the bottom in the toolbar here in Zoom. We'll go through as many questions as we can halfway through and at the end. We are recording. The recording will be posted, and the slides will also be emailed out with everybody who registered as a PDF. Next slide, please, Judith. At the end of tonight's seminar, Amy, who's with us this evening as a co-organizer, she'll make live a quick poll towards the end of the presentation. Well, we're going to be asking for your feedback about the quality of the webinar, what you learned this evening, and feedback so we can improve this and other extension education programs. As a part of that, participating, if you wish and elect to participate in the poll, Rutgers, our institutional review board, reviews that as a scientific research study, your feedback to improve these programs. So at that time, we would need your consent to participate in the poll. It's optional if you so wish, but we appreciate that feedback at the end, and you see that poll coming up at the end of the program. Next slide, please, Judith. Also, we here at Rutgers Cooperative Extension are an equal opportunity program provider and employer, providing educational programs to all in New Jersey and beyond without discrimination, including in this seminar, which is open to everybody here live, but also with the recording being posted afterwards for all being able to access the recording of tonight's educational program. Next slide, please, Judith. And with that, I'd like to formally welcome and thank our featured speaker tonight, Dr. Judith Weis. She's a professor emerita in biological sciences from Rutgers University, Newark. She's got a bachelor's degree in zoology from Cornell University, a master's and a PhD in biology from NYU. And she's had a long and successful career continuing during retirement in that emerita status in a variety of environmental and marine-related topics. In addition to working at Rutgers, she's also worked at Florida Atlantic University, Southampton College. She was a Congressional Science Fellow with the U.S. Senate, the National Science Foundation, the EPA, multiple different appointments, just to name a few in her long and continued very productive career. Primarily doing research focusing on estuary and ecology and ecotoxicology, publishing over 200 referenced articles, multiple books, including related to salt marshes, fish, crabs, and marine pollution, including microplastics, a very important hot topic here in New Jersey and beyond. A great contribution to this seminar focusing on environmental issues. Judith, thank you for making the time, keeping the time, and joining us to contribute your knowledge tonight. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I have to apologize for my voice. I have a bit of laryngitis today, but I think I'll last through the hour anyway, I hope. So let's start off so actually what is plastic? It's generally produced from oil or natural gas, and it is a combination. For example, this is a monomer. This is ethylene. Can you see my pointer when I wiggle it around?
Yes, Judith, we can.
Okay, good. And then if you take a bunch of ethylenes and line and stick them up together, make them together as a lineup, it becomes a polymer. And another example, if you have, this was your monomer, you just string up a whole string of them and you'd have a polymer. So the plastics are polymers of different monomers to form a long repeated chain. And they would be called polyethylene or polypropylene or polystyrene, depending on which monomer you started out with. And different ones will have different properties. There are also additives in the plastic beside the chain of the individual monomers. They also include additional chemicals like bisphenol A, and that turns out to be commonly used in food containers, but it is an endocrine disruptor and it can cause a number of endocrine problems. Another additive in there is phthalates, which makes the plastic more flexible, like in a car, the seats in an automobile. And it also has effects on the reproductive system. So these are chemicals in there that are not very good for you. When plastic is manufactured or destroyed by incineration, there's a lot of air pollution, exposing workers to toxic chemicals. And when it eventually degrades, which takes a long time, it releases greenhouse gases. Those additives, I mentioned phthalates and BPA, but there are thousands of other additives, over 2,000 other ones that can be in there. And most of these have barely been studied at all and not regulated at all. So there's a big question mark on what other chemicals are in there and what kind of effects it has on they have on living things. Barely any information about this. Different polymers are used for different kinds of plastic materials. So polyethylene is often in bags, polypropylene in bottle caps and ropes, and so forth. You can see different ones have different uses. And whatever you've got, it's going to last a long time in the environment. We're talking about generally hundreds of years for most of the common plastic objects that we see every day to be degraded. And we see, because they are so persistent, they are in the environment and they collect, and we see them on beaches, we see them on curbs, on roads, we see them almost everywhere. And the collection of these materials is very harmful to animals in the environment. Many marine animals eat plastic. And, in case of plastic bags, case of turtles like to eat plastic bags. This is a baby bird. You can see the colored stuff in there. It's little bits of plastic that the parent birds feed the babies. They don't know anything about this plastic. And so there's in albatrosses and far away islands, a lot of mortality of chicks. And the other main way in which it's damaging animals is by getting entangled. And here, for example, marine mammals, whales, seals, and so forth, getting entangled. And this poor turtle got stuck in this 6-pack ring when it was much smaller. And you see now it's preventing the shell from growing as the turtle grows. So the major things that you see from big pieces of plastic. But what we're going to focus on today is the microplastics, which are particles smaller than 5 millimeters. They come in many different shapes and different sizes. They come from different sources, often the breakdown of larger particles, fibers from synthetic fabrics, wearing off from tires, micro beads, little spheres that were in personal care products. This picture on the right, you can see a blown up picture. Something that's a perfect sphere is not a natural thing. That was manufactured that way. And when those were one of the first types of microplastics that were regulated. They're in cosmetics and personal care products to get abrasion, for example. Microplastics of all shapes and sizes get eaten by plankton and even eaten by bigger animals than plankton. And they're found in different tissues of marine and terrestrial and freshwater animals. This is not just a marine issue. This is everywhere. It was first looked at in the marine environment, but the same thing goes on in freshwater and terrestrial. Toxic chemicals can attach to them, and you find that animals that tend to eat them are eating plastic with a layer, perhaps, of toxic chemicals on the outside. And that's a way that the toxic chemicals can get into the food chain. The microbeads, the spheres on this upper right picture, were banned over half a decade ago. I think it was around 2015. They were banned in the US and many other countries around that same time. So they are not common anymore in the environment. We distinguish primary microplastic from ones that are made very little to begin with, like those microspheres or microbeads. There's also the pre-manufacture, they're called nurdles, cute name. This is what is put together to make plastic objects. And there was a big spill of them in Sri Lanka a few years ago. They were from a ship. Ship ran aground and spilled out, huge numbers of nurdles. They were like 6 feet deep on the beach. It was incredible. And the secondary microplastics are from the breakup of larger pieces of plastics. And they come in all shapes, colors, and sizes. And we're talking different chemicals. And they have different densities. Some will float, some will sink. And so we can't really think of microplastics as a contaminant. Microplastics are a whole collection or suite of contaminants. It's just like saying metals, but mercury is different from cadmium, is different from lead. It's the same thing in microplastics. It's a general term for a whole bunch of different things. Breaking up of larger pieces, styrofoam is very delicate, and it breaks up very easily and flies around in the wind and floats in the water and breaks up probably the most quickly. Plastic bags will also break up into smaller and smaller pieces. And the harder plastics, like plastic bottles, will take longer, but they will eventually break up into microplastics also. There have been a lot of studies done in which people try to estimate how many are there floating around in this body of water near where I am. And we have all sorts of studies from all around the world trying to count microplastics in water or sediment. And there are no standard methods for doing this. So it is impossible to compare validly one study with another. One thing that can be very different before you even start to count is how to collect them. And one still, unfortunately, pretty common way of collecting them is with a plankton net or a so-called manton net. It's a net that goes along the top of the water, and it's collecting water it will collect plankton, collection of little microscopic plants and animals, but it will also collect the microplastics. But one thing I learned a long time ago when I first took marine ecology is that the shape of the plankton is very important in how much you're going to catch in your net. You have long, thin plankton like this is much more likely to go through the holes in the net. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Than a shape like this. So elongated thin shapes and the smaller ones will go through the net a lot of the time. The other thing to do, the better way for collecting, is take a whole water sample and then put it through a filter. They call this a grab sample, and put it through the filter. Here's a look at the type of difference you'll see. If you do a collection with a net, you in this case, you could get 0.18 items. Whereas with the same water, you collect it in the whole water and put it through a filter, you would get almost 3,000 items. I mean, that's a humongous difference, 0.18 versus 2,900. That's from the same water. And the size you're going to get is different also. Here, you're going to get larger size plastic pieces because the small ones are going through the hole of the net. And then here you're getting, much smaller ones. So the pore size of what it goes through is critical to what you're going to come up with at the end. And another issue to consider is that any sample you take from the surface, like this net goes through the surface, any sample from the surface is not going to collect the heavier particles that sink to the bottom and the ones that are in the middle of the water column. So the method you collect with is critical to what you're going to get. Here's just an example. The whole water sample that goes through a filter, you find that microfibers, that is long, thin pieces like this, long, thin fibers are the most abundant, whereas samples from nets find microfibers much less abundant. And here's one study that said plankton nets may underestimate concentrations of fibers by 3 to 4 orders of magnitude. That's a huge amount, 3 to 4 orders of magnitude, compared to the grab method. And then a meta-analysis, which was comparing a whole lot of different studies, found that the average sample composition in the water column was 52% fibers, followed by 29% fragments, with other shapes, including the round beads and films and foams and others, making up a much smaller proportion. So if you collect with a net, you're going to miss the most important group, the most important shape, which are the fibers. Once you've collected them, what are you going to do? And there's different ways of analyzing what you've got. The easiest that every lab is likely to have is a microscope, which is convenient and not that difficult, but it has a higher error rate than using, high-tech GCMS or Raman or Fourier transform infrared that will not only give you a count, but it will also identify which polymers you're seeing. So this is certainly preferable, but much more expensive, obviously. So as I said before, we have to consider microplastics as a suite of contaminants that are differing in shape. We got fibers, fragments, spheres, films, foams, and so forth. They're differing in color. They're different in chemistry because we have different polymers, and they're differing in size. And all of this is critical to how they're going to behave in the environment and what effects they're going to have on organisms. So, I mean, this diagram, I think, kind of shows you really all the differences, and some are going to sink and some are going to float and so forth. So they are all a great variety of different things that are behaving differently and having different effects. Where do they come from? Okay, here's a pie chart showing where most of them come from. And the biggest chunk of this pie chart, 35%, is clothing and textiles. So it's the fibers. The fibers are coming from the textiles. The second most common source is tires. Do you ever wonder what happened to the rubber when your tires get thin and you lose the tread? You ever think what happened to all that rubber? It came off in little bitty pieces as you were driving on the roads. The third thing is city dust, and then, various other things. And then the spheres, the microbeads, so the beauty products are only 2% of the whole thing. So they're not an important component anymore. This was an article in yesterday's New York Times. This was in the opinion section. And I read this whole article and I looked at all the pictures. And what do you see in those pictures? There is not a single item of clothing, and there is not a single tire in all those pictures. And I'm not going to read you the article, but the article totally ignores the fact that when we're talking about microplastics, we're not talking of them coming mostly from toothbrushes or dice or plastic hangers. They're coming mostly from clothes and tires. And you'd never get that from either looking at the pictures or reading this article. And I was just so shocked and kind of angry that the Times printed this article yesterday that's ignoring where most of them are coming from. So most of them are coming from our laundry, the fibers. And 100,000 can come off of one item of synthetic clothing in one washing. And then after you wash it, you put it in the dryer and it's releasing more into the air. So we have the microplastics, microfibers are not trapped in standard filters in washing machines. They're too light to get caught in traps. They are largely collected by wastewater treatment plants, sewage treatment plants do get over 90% of them. But when you have such humongous numbers, the 10% or even 5% that's left still means that you're getting millions reaching the waterways every minute. And those that are filtered out end up in the sludge. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And sometimes applied to agricultural fields. So now we're getting the possibility that these microplastics are getting into crops, not necessarily a good thing. So we've got a lot of them ending up in rivers, lakes, and oceans where chemical pollution in those water bodies can attach onto the outside of the plastic. And they are also going to get consumed by animals, including fish, which in turn are consumed by us. There are some differences that have been noted in terms of how you do the laundry. Top loading machines release a lot more than front loaders. Hot water releases more than cold water. The gentle cycle releases more than a standard cycle, which is kind of surprising, not what I would have predicted. And old clothes shed more than new clothes. So there's are some ways that the individual who washes clothes can make a difference. So here on the left, basically summarizing the problem. The washing machine, here's the little fibers are coming off the fabric in the washing machine, going into the water and eaten by the fish, and then you got the fish on your dinner plate. And then the diagram on the right is showing, different types of fabrics, polyester versus acrylic versus blah, 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 are releasing different numbers of microfibers per wash. And conditioner increases the release too. Now, it's not just when you wash textiles. It is these textiles are releasing microfibers through their entire life cycle. When they're manufactured at the beginning, it's releasing microfibers. When you're using them and wearing them, even when you're wearing them, they're shedding. You walk around, they're shedding. Your carpet and your floor is full of microfibers from your clothing. So during the time that you're using them and washing them, when you're washing them, there they go. And it's going out into the ocean or freshwater systems, and in the sludge, perhaps into terrestrial system. Disposal at the end of life of a garment, it goes to a landfill somewhere, and it's continuing to shed. So we have the potential of problems of ecosystem health, toxicity, and human health effects in the marine, freshwater, and terrestrial environment. Now, it's not only synthetic fibers that release fibers, the synthetic fabrics. Wool and cotton also do too. However, the cotton and the wool, you see here, this is the polyester, the plastic, and these are other plastics, these four. And then you've got wool is this green on the top, and cotton is this red or dark red. So they're, kind of the amounts have been pretty steady since 1980, while the polyester has been steadily increasing. The difference with the wool and the cotton, they're releasing microfibers too, but their microfibers will ultimately break down sooner, but not as soon as you hope. The cotton can stay around quite a while, so it's not an easy answer to the problem, because they have the fibers and they do stay around longer than you want. Another source of microplastic is the fake lawns, the plastic lawns. This is Lincoln Center near where I live, that one summer decided to put down this fake lawn. And people with their babies are playing on it, dogs are playing on it, and everybody's inhaling microplastics sitting there. Looking at the food chain, this is a picture of a larval fish. It was from a laboratory experiment, and you see a lineup here in its intestine of microplastic beads that look like they're kind of going through and they're going to get pooped out. Plankton and baby fish eat microplastics, and there's some animals that seem to prefer eating plastics over food, and microplastics get passed up the food chain. They're found everywhere in the world that people have looked for them. It doesn't appear to be any place that's too remote. The top of the mountains, the deepest part of the ocean, it's like they're everywhere. And they're actually more in bottled water than tap water. So you're drinking bottled water is worse in terms of microplastic. Most species that have been looked at contain microplastics. This is just a picture of another lab where luminescent microplastics were fed to this little shrimp larva, and you can see them glowing through the tissues of the animal. Now, just about any animal looked at will have been found to eat them, but the question is why? And it could vary. There's a fish called an amber striped scad that eats blue copepods. That's the kind of copepods that live right near the surface of the ocean, tends to have a blue color. It's a camouflage at the very surface. And so this fish normally eats blue copepods. It really goes after blue microplastics too. So that's one way you can say it's vision. but most of the time, it's the smell of the plastic. And it's some species, like corals, prefer new virgin microplastics, fresh ones that haven't got a coating of other chemicals around them. Whereas most animals prefer plastics that have been in the water for a while. They've got a collection of microbes that have attached to them. That's called the biofilm. So you can see individual cells, little diatoms, bacteria, a bunch of different things attached on the outside of the microplastic. And that apparently gives it the right smell. And the animals go after them because it smells good. The ones with the more biofilm on the outside become heavier and are more likely to sink. Here's just another look at the different kinds of critters that make the biofilm. As you get more and more, the microplastic will get heavier and sink as it's got a bigger and bigger collection of little critters on the outside. And then it also gets absorption of chemicals from the water, pollution molecules, PCBs, whatever, that are in the water will attach on also. So you've got the presence of absorbed contaminants and the biofilm on the outside of the plastic particle. And so it's more likely to sink, and it may embed in the sediment and then affect the animals that are living in the sediment at the bottom. I have you look at this for a second, thinking about which shape of microplastic is more likely to just go through the gut and out the other end without causing a problem. Which shape is more likely to do some damage to the tissues, and which shape is more likely to clog up the gut. And since I'm not seeing you and raising your hands or whatever, I will tell you, I think the fairly obvious answer, that something smooth and round can go through and out more easily than something with sharp edges, which could more likely damage the inside of the gut. And something that can form tangles like this is more likely to clog up the gut. They have found plastics in the stomachs of deep sea creatures from 7 miles down, the deep trenches in the ocean that are 7 miles deep. And here's an arrowworm, and there is this blue thread in it, a microfiber that this worm has eaten. So, if you're finding fibers inside animals from 7 miles down in the ocean, there's no place that they're not going to be found. Deep sea animals depend greatly on food coming down from above. And as things are sinking down from the surface, it's taking plastic and pollution with them. Interesting about bivalve mollusks, which are filter feeders, but they're very selective. They're not just monitoring what's everything there. People have suggested they would be good monitors for what's out there in the water, but that's not really true, because they are very selective. They will initially take in, and then they will get rid of very quickly things they don't want. They put out what's called pseudofeces. That's the equivalent of spitting out something. It hasn't gone through the whole digestive system. You took it in and you didn't like it and you spit it out. And that's basically pseudofeces. And then another percentage is found in the feces that did pass through the digestive system. And they can be pretty fussy about what they take in and in terms of what polymer and what sizes. Here's a bivalve here, and you've got different, polyethylene terephthalate, different polymers, and you see it really likes the PET the best. It takes them up and takes up far less of these other polymers. And it also has preference of what size. You see, A is class 2, that is this. This size is the preferred size, and that's the one that accumulates the most compared to all the other sizes. So you can see these are very, very fussy about which polymer and what size they really want to eat. Similarly, different shapes will have differential accumulation and damage to the gut. This is a fish here where they found that accumulation in the gut, fibers the most, fragments secondly, and thirdly, the spheres or beads. And the effects was the same way. The fibers had the most severe effects, and the fragments following, and the beads had the least effect. As said, most of the microplastics in animals are fibers and fragments, and beads make up, the spheres make up a very small proportion. And mostly when you collect an animal, you'll find most of them in the gut, in the digestive system. Some of those are just passing through and aren't really accumulating. Most lab experiments that are feeding microplastics to animals are using the beads, the spheres, at high concentrations. Fibers could be the highest because they're the most abundant in the environment, number one, and or two, they're not eliminated as efficiently as other shapes. And I think both of these are true, that they are in fact, yes, the most abundant shape in the environment, and they are likely to tangle up and not go through the gut as smoothly as other particles. So we need to have more study of elimination, egestion, along with ingestion. Everybody focuses on ingestion, but just because you take it in doesn't mean it's really going to do any damage at all. It could be just passing through at the other end and do nothing. So this needs to be looked at. The picture is referring to a study where they had old museum specimens of fish collected before around 1950. And they found in fish collected before 1950, there's no microplastics. And then as you get more and more recent collections of fish, you get more concentrations of microplastics, and all of them were fibers, polyester, for example. And over the time, the microplastic counts in the freshwater fish were increasing. Okay, now it's the time for some questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Judith, for a really strong start there, communicating how diverse these issues are related to microplastics, where they come from, and the wide distribution here. We have some really good questions lined up here for the first Q&A break. First up, earlier on, Harvey asked, can plastics degrade to such a small size that they no longer become problematic?
Well, the microplastics keep getting smaller and smaller and turn into nanoplastics. And there is increasing study of nanoplastics, more difficult to study because you cannot see them in a microscope. But they are more likely to go through tissues and may end up being more damaging because they are getting into organs that most microplastics are too big to penetrate. So I suppose eventually it gets so small that it's almost nothing, but we've got to get through the nanoplastics and learn some more about them before we can get to that point.
Good point. Thank you for that, Judith. Harvey had also asked about the ingestion versus egestion, which you just touched on. But Amanda's wondering, do you know of any human complications due to microplastic consumption?
That comes at the end. I'll get there.
Gotcha. Okay. Somewhat related, if you want to punt, or you might be able to answer it here. Nancy asks, is there any kind of a medical test that can determine how many or what percentage have accumulated in a person's body?
I don't think so. I think if you took a piece of your body and had it analyzed under the microscope, somebody could count how, if you wanted to chop off a piece of your finger or something, they could count. Just kidding. To get a count of in your body while your body is all alive and all attached together, I don't see how they could do that. I mean, they've looked at, from cadavers, and they've looked at placentas, liver tissue from cadavers and other, and blood, and it's all over our bodies. It's all over our bodies.
Thanks. Probably some interesting collaborations also with the medical school, maybe, Judith.
Yeah, possibly, yeah.
So Bargavi asks, can something such as petase have an impact in the degradation of microplastics? Are there any commercially available solutions to degrade microplastics?
Not that I know of.
Cool, we got several more good ones coming in. Sarah asked about washing machines, which I know you have that coming up later on. What people
comes up
can do.
more in the end.
Yep. Alexandra is curious, why do researchers keep focusing on the beads if that's not a major fraction of the microplastics?
I'll get to that too.
Okay. Andy's curious, as far as eating fish and crustaceans, how much plastic makes it into the fish that we eat? Do they make it out of the digestive systems?
Some does. Some, but it depends. It all depends. I'm coming to a little bit more to that in a minute.
Gotcha. Jamie asked early on, other than the fact that plant-derived plastics come from renewable resources rather than fossil fuels, is there any difference in the environmental breakdown of these plastics?
I don't think so. So it's sort of, it's nice that they're not made from fossil fuels, but they're still plastic, and they're still doing and behaving the way other plastics do.
Good. I got a bit inundated there with questions, Judith, since there was some overlap with what you have coming up. So how about you continue, and I'll organize the Q&A, and we'll hit you again at the end.
Okay, here we go. Here's what I was going to talk. Here's a diagram of an animal, a very theoretical animal. And you have a mouth at one end and an anus at the other end. And things get taken in and perhaps digested and goes through an intestine and then comes out. The waste goes out. What counts really is this: how much gets out of the gut and assimilated into the other cells of the body. I can argue that materials in the gut are not truly in the animal. You've got this thing opening at both ends, and in some sense, this isn't really in the animal. You're not in the animal till you're here. What you've gone through the gut, and then you've gone into the liver, or you've gone into the muscles, or you've assimilated one place or another. And that's really in the animal. And how much really gets, quote, in the animal depends on the complexity of the digestive tract, how long it is, how complicated it is, the shape of it, and so forth. Plus the nature of the particle. How big is the particle? A smaller particle is more likely to get out than a bigger particle. And so that is a complex issue that people should be focusing on more. But certainly the smaller particles are more likely to be able to move out and get into tissues. I've seen papers that talk about microplastics in the gut, and they call it bioaccumulation. And I don't think that's a good term for it, because they may just be passing through. And a bioaccumulation is once you get out here into the body cells. But this term has now been used, and I don't like it. Here's something I think is really cool. A shrimp has a structure in its gut called the gastric mill, and they fed the shrimp both fibers and spheres, and they went in, and this gastric mill went round and round and round, and it sorted them out so that the spheres kept going down the intestine and got pooped out at the end, whereas the fibers went back and got vomited out or regurgitated from the front end. And I just thought this was very cool. It's not, it's not rocket science, but I thought it was an interesting thing that the shrimp was able to separate the two different shapes and give them a different route to get out of its body. All right, now I'm getting into a lot of the lab studies, and I'm going to be criticizing them. And there was one question about this. Most common material used is polystyrene, which is rare in the environment. Most of the studies use concentrations much greater than the levels in the environment. And many studies use spheres, which, as I've shown, are a very small percentage, perhaps 2% of what's out there in the environment. But you can buy them very easily. You can buy a vial of spheres of a particular polymer and a particular size, and you might be able to get them to be fluorescent if you want it, or different color, or whatever. So it is easy, and you have a bottle on the shelf in your lab, and you can sprinkle this in, and obviously you're going to quantitate how much you're going to put in the water that you're going to treat your animals with. But that is why people do use so much with spheres. It's convenient. And so we see that some studies, there is adverse effects on organisms exposed to very high concentrations. And effects are seen, biochemical effects, effects on development, on growth, on behavior. But then there are also some studies with high concentrations that find no effects. Some studies don't provide food. Now, if you're not feeding the animals may be suffering from lack of food, starvation, and they may be attributing these effects to plastic, but the animal may truly be starving. So there are a lot of studies out there that are not, great studies, in my opinion. They also, the exposure time in many studies is a matter of hours or days, whereas in the real world, animals are getting exposed for months, years. So you have a disconnect, a real disconnect between the real world and the laboratory studies. Looking at the contaminants, the chemical contaminants, there's two different types. There's the chemical contaminants that are inside the plastic. These are the additives, like the phthalates and BPA, that are shown in red. They're chemical ingredients in the plastic. But then there's also the environmental chemicals that are going to come and stick on the outside. Adsorb is the word, absorbed contaminants, blue here, that can come like PAHs, that's chemicals in oil, or metals, or PCBs, common contaminant chemicals that will stick on the outside. So you have two different types. We have the chemicals on the inside and the chemicals on the outside. And that's why some people have referred to this as a cocktail of contaminants. I would add that in addition to this usual suite of environmental chemicals and additives, if we're focusing on microfibers, which we ought to because they're the most abundant ones, they have specific chemicals that aren't present in other kinds of plastic, namely chemicals that are added to textiles for anti-wrinkle effects, dyes to make it red or blue or green. And dyes tend to be very toxic chemicals. You're not going to find dyes in other shapes of microplastics, but they are something that need to be looked at because microfibers are the most abundant. So then there's this question about, can animals, during the time that an animal, that the microplastic is passing through the animal, can the chemicals adsorbed on the surface come off in the gut, or will it all just go through? So here was an experiment where they had PBDEs, polybrominated diphenyl ethers, that got concentrated on the microplastics and fed to the fish. And the fish extracted those chemicals and then pooped out the clean microplastics. So in this case, yes, the chemicals came, the animal's gut took those chemicals and got the chemicals off the microplastics and got the chemicals into the fish itself. That's not always the case, though. In some case, it depends on what chemicals and what animals and how long does it take to pass through the gut. All those are factors which will determine to what degree the plastics are being a vehicle for getting the chemicals into the animal. If we think about how much bioaccumulation there is from eating contaminated microplastics compared to how much chemicals the fish would get from eating a contaminated prey item, real food, the chemicals are much more available from prey organisms than from microplastics. And then another question we might want to ask is, are additives that are inside the plastic more or less available than the chemicals that are adsorbed on the outside? At the first thought, you think, well, the adsorbed chemicals are more exposed and more likely to be able, but it doesn't, I don't, you have to study and see to find the answer to that kind of question. At any rate, microplastics are getting in at lower parts of the food chain and transferred up the food chain. And there's more questions to ask here, depending on different sizes, types, and shapes of microplastics. Are there differences in how they can move up the food chain? Microplastics are also found in the gills of animals. And I think we need to have a lot more study of respiration, of gills. More study of this. There's been a great focus on eating as the major thing. And that's what most of the studies are focusing on, eating. I think it's important to look more at respiration and look at gills. I think it may end up being much more important ultimately than the digestive system. And it would be true for terrestrial and soil organisms as well. And I think about the fact that animals eat now and then, but are breathing all the time. And the fact that they're breathing all the time would suggest there's a constant influx of microplastics into the respiratory system. Now, microplastics are also in the air. Not only, from dryers, yes. Fibers are coming out into the air from dryers, but it's coming out, from the car tires, from, people walking around and shedding them on the street. so we have a whole lot of microplastics in the air, and they're getting inhaled by terrestrial animals, including us. And so we have all sorts of sources, and dust, cosmetics, medicine, clothes, whatever. Ingestion, inhalation, and dermal. This is the one I'm pointing to as thinking we need a lot more attention on inhalation, respiration. So they're studying, in labs and rats and mice, health effects of microplastics. They have been found in people's lungs. How much damage are they doing? Well, there are evidence from occupational health, textile workers, processing of polyester and nylon fibers caused respiratory problems, reduced lung capacity, wheezing, and so forth, develop inflammation of the lungs or asthma, things like that. Back to the water. Now, we're looking at the sewage coming out from primarily the washing machines, where most of the fibers, microplastics, are coming from. I'm not going into the details of what a sewage treatment plant is, but suffice it to say, we've got a primary and a secondary treatment. At the end of the secondary treatment, you end up with the discharge of the cleaner, the cleaned up water into the surface water, or maybe to a third level of treatment, and the sludge. And I said before, most of the microplastics will be in the sludge phase. And the question is, what's done with the sludge? It tends to be applied to the soil. And so we are moving these microplastics into the soil. We're moving pollution from one place to another isn't a great, solution. And they call that beneficial use. And I question if it is. I think we need a lot more research on what happens to the microfibers in the sludge when it's applied to soil. If it's agricultural soil, is it getting into our food? If it's not agricultural food, is it getting into the earthworms and then getting into the birds that eat the earthworms and so forth, into terrestrial ecosystems? Okay, we have some relatively easy ways of reducing the outflow from washing machines. We have two pretty cheap things that can go into the washing machine. One called the Cora Ball, this thing. This is a Guppy Friend bag. They collect 25-30% of the microfibers. This thing is a special filter, and this one is available here, called a lint lover filter, that you can attach onto a washing machine. I think they cost about $150. And this will collect 90 or so percent of the filters from the wash, from the wash. So of the fibers. So this, I think of this as the low-lying fruit to get a pretty quick, significant reduction of the microfibers coming out. Other approaches are the textile companies that are working on how to develop fabrics to shed less. And I just want to make sure, and they're working on perhaps coatings on it or different ways of making a textile that it will shed less. And they just should be careful not to make new problems. Okay, the coating. So they're studying all this stuff to try to figure out. One thing has to do with the yarn fiber length. If the short fibers will fall off more easily than very long fibers, and how tightly woven the fabric is. Something that's loose will be shedding microfibers. So for example, the fuzz on fleeces, that comes off the easiest because it's very loose and small. If you took a fleece, and you know, the inside of a fleece jacket is not fleece. The fleece is just on the outside. It's a tight weave on the inside. If you made the fleece the inside of a sandwich and had a tight weave on the outside as well as the inside, you know, so you had 3 layers with on both the outside and the inside would be a tight weave, and the fuzzy fleece would be in the middle. This would be, you know, reducing shedding a great deal. Okay, I'm running out of time.
Yeah. Hello, excuse me, Judith. Can I just have everyone take the poll that
Yeah,
I'm going to
sure.
launch right now, just so that we can get your opinions on this webinar before we all log off. So I have started the poll. Please answer. And now I will let Judith finish. Thank you.
Should I keep going while people are doing this?
Yes, please.
Okay, I think I'm gonna skip this is sort of legal and policy things that some countries and some states are doing. Let me just mention on the bottom, new washing in France. They have a law that says new washing machines have being sold as of 2025 must be equipped with a filter to collect the microfibers. And so that's a law that's passed in France. There are bills to this effect in both California and Oregon. So stay tuned. I bet there will be more states coming up with bills. I think this filter thing is the quickest way of getting a big reduction in microfiber output. Can I go to the last slide? Let me see.
I think so, Judith.
I don't want to go there. All right, the last slide, which I cannot make to come up, is about what you can do. And it's mostly in terms of what you can do when you do the laundry. And it depends, of course, if you have a private home or you go to a laundromat or you're in an apartment building with a laundry room. But if you have a choice, use a front loader instead of a top loader. Use less detergent. Don't bother with the conditioner. Use cold water instead of hot water. And if you have a private home, you can buy one of those filters for your washing machine. If you have a private home, you probably can, not in the dead of winter, but for, you know, starting when the spring, summer and fall, after your clothes are washed, you can hang them on a line to dry, and you will avoid all the fibers that are coming off in the dryer. So there are all sorts of things, managing the way you do laundry. And then there are other things you can do just in terms of reducing plastic in general. In terms, I mean, the state of New Jersey has a plastic bag ban, so that's good. And there's also, I think, that stores should not be giving you a straw unless you ask for it. Restaurants and takeout places should not be giving you all the plastic utensils and stuff unless you ask for them. So both New York and New Jersey are making some strides. We have big enforcement problems in New York. I hope New Jersey has less. But that's what the last slide was about. So I'm done. I'm ready for some additional questions if there are some.
Awesome. Thank you, Judith, and appreciate the valuable education and raising awareness on these critical issues here. A bit alarming, but through education and some of the solutions you're sharing there, hopefully progress will be made, including through further research. I'm going to end the poll in a moment, and then while we're taking Q&A, people can see your last slide in addition to hearing those recommendations that you just gave. But with some great Q&A here while we have you, Both Alexandra and another participant were asking, with these filters, how do you dispose of the fibers from those filters afterwards?
Right. I know the one in Europe, which is not the brand that Lint Lover is, a different one. What they do, they have a sort of a cartridge with a filter, and you mail it, a dirty one, back to them, and they'll send you a clean one. So that's the way it works in Europe. I don't know how the one works here, but I think it really will, to be effective, it will require a major education of consumers. And I don't know whether the company is doing that or not. But I guess I should go to a store and find out how they do it. But I think the individual household has to do something. Obviously, you can't just pull it off and flush it down the toilet. That'd be all for naught. It will require a committed consumer to do it right, whatever it is. I need to find out more about it.
These practices hopefully become increasingly mainstream, make it easier for participation. Gayleen asks and notes, a few years ago, they attended a workshop on microplastics. The emphasis was on the problem of plastic bags, bottles, and microbeads in cosmetic products. Now the emphasis seems to be on fibers. Is this shift based upon more recent research and or the fact that bags and single-use products are starting to be banned?
Both. I mean, I think a lot of people, the attention was first on the microbeads that could be just easily done away with. There's no need to have pieces of plastic in these facial scrubs and makeup. It could be something organic, ground up pits from some fruit or something, or even grains of sand. So it was easy. It was easy. And I think the problem, some of the contemporary problems of people using beads in laboratory studies, again, it's easy. It's much harder to get fibers or fragments. You can't just buy them. Did I answer the whole question?
Yes, I think you did at the onset, that it's a mixture of more recent research and that bans have been put in place on other single-use plastics.
Oh, yeah.
So Steve asks, notes contractors are using plastic products like AZAC and Trex. They are cutting this material on the ground without vacuums or any means for collecting the waste. Are there any laws or actions mandating the cutting of this material to protect this from entering the environment?
I don't think so.
That question came up when we hosted a microplastics seminar last year, especially all development in our lagoons and waterfronts.
Yeah, I know, what's his name? Tom Nosker at Rutgers is involved with a of plastic lumber that's used in boardwalks and benches and so forth, which is a nice idea. The question is what happens at the end of life of those objects.
Right on. Bill notes that some local fertilizer is made from composted materials. Would it carry microplastic content into the soil and eventually into our vegetables and our diets?
I would predict that it would.
He had another question.
You're having it in your diet anyway. But certainly I would expect that would.
David was wondering, do plastic eating bacteria help?
They could help if you had enough of them concentrated where you needed them. But since these microplastics are everywhere in the whole planet, you know, I don't know in a very local area, the plastic eating bacteria could do something, but we're dealing with a problem of these things being everywhere.
Trish threw in the chat, unfortunately, the lint lover requires the user to clean the screen by flushing it with water. On their website, frequently asked questions states some people like best to clean the filter by spraying it outside with a garden hose.
Uh-oh, that doesn't sound good to me at all.
No, so probably some improvements needed in the back end there for best practices. All right, got a couple more good ones here. Sarah was curious, do you know any ways to recycle toothpaste containers?
No.
I didn't find any evident at first glance science-based web pages, but there is some information online for Sarah or others if you want to look further into that. Lauren was wondering, are there any health risks for consuming seafood that you're aware of related to microplastics? And is there any safe to eat?
There is no evidence that the amount of microplastics you're getting from seafood has any health problems. But bear in mind, you're probably getting microplastics when you're breathing the air and when you're eating other things. So it was initially considered a marine problem, but since they're everywhere, the microplastics are very likely to be in your vegetables and your meat that's not fish and other things that you eat.
So Donna early on asked, what can be done to increase plastic recycling efforts? And I'll add, how effective in this combating the microplastic pollution might recycling be?
Recycling has been, pushed for how many decades already? And plastic recycling doesn't work well because we have many different polymers that are different colors. And you recycle, you can't put a blue one and an orange one together. So your laundry bottle is an orange color and your bottle of something else is blue. They can't go together. And if there's different polymers, they can't go together either. So this is the reason that recycling ends up being, somewhere around only 5% of what we think we're recycling actually gets recycled. And what most people involved in this are thinking that, the recycling is not going to work. And what we need to do is stop making so much plastic in the first place. And that the way to approach this is there's bills in a lot of states that are saying that the industry who makes it needs to be responsible for what happens at the end. So they call that extended producer responsibility. That, it's not our individual responsibility as consumers for making sure that, this bottle goes into the right thing at the recycling plant, because we're not at the recycling plant. We don't run the recycling plant. That the producer needs to be financially responsible for what goes on at the end. That's called extended producer responsibility. And it has passed in Oregon and California. And I think we need to be looking to the West Coast states to see how to make this work. California is way ahead of the game in a lot of it. And I think we need to be watching them and learning from them.
Great, thank you, Judith. And then Steve Yurjo, co-host, just put a link in the chat. Speaker last year as part of their seminar series, Earth Day Every Day, spoke about basics of recycling. So folks can follow up more on that as well if they wish. Judith, Lauren asks, how effective are the laundry detergent sheets versus the plastic bottles?
Well, I am using, a solid, sheet rather than a liquid detergent lately. So that's, the bottles of liquid detergent are not part of my life anymore. So I'm using these sheets and they seem to clean the clothes just as well.
Interesting.
I also have, for shampoo, I buy a bar, like a bar of soap. It's a bar of shampoo. So I'm not using shampoo bottles anymore either.
An anonymous attendee asks, if the policy approaches slide still up, what policies do you suggest could be implemented for the textile industry if none exist currently?
Well, they seem to be taking this seriously. And, they are looking into how to get fabrics that shed less. And I think Patagonia is one company that's, taking a lead. There's certainly, as in so many other things, there may be, what they call greenwashing going on, saying you're doing good stuff and you're not really. But I would give them a few more years to come up with something. I think, if there were more of the public were aware about all this, and garment could have in its label, if people would look at the label, to what degree it sheds when you wash it, things like that, and that they could come up with, fabrics that shed less. And I think that's feasible, and they're working on it. On the other hand, I haven't heard of the tire companies doing anything. I read about the textile manufacturers, but the tires are a pretty big chunk of those microplastics. And I haven't heard anything about what any tire company is doing to try to do something about that. And I think they ought to be stepping up also.
Good point, Judith. I forgot what news outlet covered it about 3 years ago or so, that the issue of pollution from the tire wear in, I think it was San Francisco Bay. And I think then there was a laboratory study looking at those concentrations, how it would impact, I think, salmon fry.
Yes, salmon. There's a chemical in the tire wear that is especially toxic, kills salmon. I forget the name of it. It's a phenol something or other. But it's interesting because it's nowhere near as toxic with for other fish, but it's really lethal for salmon. And I don't know if that is an essential chemical that a tire needs to have, or can they make tires without that chemical? I don't know.
Cast about one or two more at you here, Judith, while we got you. Sarah asked much earlier this evening, do glass bottles break down and are they bad for the waterway too? And I'll add,
Glass will eventually break down, and it's will be part of the sand, will eventually just fall completely into pieces and be part of the mineral on the bottom. I don't worry about glass.
is glass in some ways environmentally a viable substitute for plastic?
Well, we used to have things come in glass bottles, didn't we?
Mhm.
It's just that plastic is cheaper and plastic doesn't break so much, so it was handy. But back in the day, before the 1950s, everything that was in a bottle came in a glass bottle and people did okay. I mean, occasionally they fell and they broke and you had a spill, which wouldn't have happened, I guess, in a plastic bottle. But people survived for many, couple hundred years with glass bottles.
Mhm. One last question for you, Judith. Asma asks, what synthetic fabrics would be best to use?
Well, if that's the last question, I can't answer that one.
Oh,
I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's a matter of saying polyester is better than poly this or poly that. I think in some studies, some have been certain polymers may be more toxic than others, but I don't really remember. I think, it's a universal problem in terms of the microplastics, regardless of what particular polymer they're made of. Some may be slightly worse and slightly better than others, but the same basic problems are there.
well, great. Thank you, Judith. We just got through all the questions in almost an hour and a half. So thank you very much for
Okay.
contributing your knowledge and time this evening on this very important environmental issue. Just after Earth Day, I know you're doing a lot of initiatives related to this and others. A great contribution also here to this series, all the small things with big environmental impacts. The recording will be posted and the slides will be emailed out as a PDF to everybody who registered. The next seminar as a part of this series will be on May 15th. Dr. Donna Fennell from Rutgers University will be speaking about bioremediation with bacteria. The link's in the chat if you want to go there to also find descriptions to register for the next seminars. And also that's where the postings will be posted there. The recordings will be posted on the Earth Day Everyday program. Still have 62 people with us, so thank you everybody for the great interest in this important issue. Hearing from Judith, an expert on this subject. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for completing the poll. I think we're at 100% completing the poll too, so appreciate your feedback. Be well, and we'll hopefully see many of you for the next seminar in this series on May 15th.
Okay, bye everybody.
Bye, Judith. Excellent job. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you again soon.